Once someone asked me what I did to be so successful at 65, and I replied that the secret wasn't intellect, but the brutal discipline of murdering the man I used to be. Machiavelli taught that a prince's virtù is not his goodness, but the iron discipline to shape his own fortune and not allow himself to be governed by passions. At 38, my life looked like a commercial for unshakable success. Julian, Victoria, and I were an inseparable trinity in elite circles. I was the intellectual architect of Sterling & Co., the man who spent sleepless nights designing the project that would change the market. Julian was my best friend, the brother life gave me, and Victoria was the woman with whom I planned to build an empire. Back then, everything was fine. We lived through expensive dinners and constant laughter, unaware that I was merely feeding the predators sleeping in my own bed. I did not know, in practice, the concept of strategic privacy. I made the classic mistake of announcing every step of my plans to Julian, seeking his validation and advice. I believed that sharing my vision strengthened our bond, but most people fail precisely because they seek applause before execution. I opened my maps, detailed every gap in the market, and handed over my strategy on a silver platter, seeking a well done that massaged my ego. I didn't realize that by talking too much I was transferring my power. I sought validation for efforts that had not yet generated concrete fruits, acting like an amateur who needs an audience to feel important and secure. At that time, I was the opposite of what I became. I did not master the power of the vacuum. I thought that being always available and totally transparent was the basis of trust, when in fact, it is silence that creates the mystery necessary to intimidate and disturb others. Julian observed everything, absorbing my intelligence while I filled every space with my ideas. I was loud with my dreams, while he was silent with his intentions. By not maintaining mystery, I became predictable and easy to map. I didn't understand that an information vacuum is a trap for the enemy, and my need to be understood was merely providing Julian with the perfect script for my own replacement. I still did not speak the language of execution. I wasted hours giving detailed explanations about the how and why of every move to Victoria and Julian, failing to notice that explanations are crutches for victims, while results are the only dialect of the powerful. I was so focused on being the nice guy and the present partner that I forgot that, in the game of power, you don't justify your actions, you execute them. I handed them the gold of my intellect wrapped in justifications and affection. At 38, I thought we were partners in a brilliant future, but I was just the architect building a fortress from which I would be expelled as soon as the last stone was laid. The atmosphere at Sterling & Co. began to shift subtly, a chill that I, in my naivety, attributed only to the pressure of the big launch. Julian, who was once my constant shadow, started closing his office door for private meetings, always leaving with an encouraging pat on my shoulder and telling me to focus only on technical issues while he handled the politics. I accepted this division of tasks as a gesture of brotherhood, not realizing that the project I had bled for was being slowly renamed in the corridors of power. Victoria, in our dinners, encouraged my total transparency, urging me to reveal every strategic detail to Julian, the man who, in silence, was already sharpening the knife he would plunge into my back. The day of the board meeting, which should have been our coronation, became my public execution. Julian stood before the directors and presented the expansion plan as his exclusive creation, without mentioning my name a single time. I sat paralyzed, watching my soul's work being sold as his genius, while applause filled the room like static noise. It was there that I felt the need for emotional alchemy, I transmuted the lead of shock into the gold of cold observation. I didn't scream. I didn't stand up. I looked at Julian's face, a mask of prefabricated arrogance, and realized that the passions of friendship had blinded me to the duty of self-preservation. In that instant, I became a data collection machine. Shortly after the announcement, Julian called me into his new office, the CEO plaque now shining on the door. Sitting in the chair my effort had bought, he distilled a poison disguised as protection. "Arthur, I did this because I know you well. You couldn't handle the weight of this chair. You're a creative genius, but you're too soft for the brutality this position demands. I took on this burden to spare you from the pressure that would crush you." That sentence was the seal of his pride. He was stealing my future while claiming he was doing me a favor. I applied self-mastery absolutely, burying alive the urge to leap at his throat. I did not negotiate with humiliation. I processed it as pure fuel. During the following months, I lived under the end of negotiation, serving the man who plundered me while he paraded his new authority. I watched Julian being coddled by the board while I worked in the shadows to maintain the gears he didn't know how to operate. Victoria remained by my side, but her eyes now shone for Julian's position, not my presence. I practiced discipline as violence against my own ego, enduring his condescension every day in silence. I didn't know yet that physical betrayal was coming, but I was already training my mind to be unbreakable, transforming the pain of being a helper into a force of relentless and silent nature. 3 months had passed since Julian usurped the throne of Sterling & Co., and the pressure of carrying his incompetence on my back finally took its toll. On a suffocating afternoon, a sudden anxiety attack tightened my chest, a physical manifestation of someone exhausted inside. I decided to leave early, unable to fake normalcy for another minute. I passed by the CEO's office to inform him, but the leather chair was empty. I imagined he was at some business lunch steeped in vanity, and decided I would tell him later. I still spoke the language of slaves, seeking permission to care for my own health, unaware that I was about to suffer the blow that would teach me the language of execution. Upon arriving home, the strangeness was immediate. Julian's car was parked in front of my building. My brain, still addicted to making excuses for others, tried to process it as an urgent visit or a technical problem. However, a primal instinct, something Machiavelli would call strategic intuition, took hold of me. The anxiety that once paralyzed me began to transmute into something denser. I entered slowly, with the light steps of someone beginning to practice the power of the vacuum, avoiding any noise that might betray my presence. The door was ajar, an unforgivable oversight by someone who feels so secure in power that they forget to watch their own back. The silence of the house was heavy, charged with the promise of a devastating revelation. The sound came from the bedroom, a laugh I knew well, but which sounded different in that context. I stood motionless in the hallway, listening to Victoria and Julian desecrate the only space I still considered sacred. Her words cut through the air like a poisoned dart. "Arthur is too predictable. He is too weak." Julian laughed, a roar full of pride that confirmed the professional betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. In that moment, the animal impulse was to kick down the door and commit a physical atrocity, but I applied the 3-second rule, 1, 2, 3, and acted before fury destroyed me. I practiced discipline as violence, a brutal suppression of the heart to save the mind, withdrawing from that house in absolute silence. I hit the streets under a rain that seemed to wash away my old identity, The initial fury which begged for blood was cooled by a glacial logic. I realized that immediate revenge is an amateur's mistake. I went to the company in the middle of the night and filed my resignation, abandoning Julian to his own mediocrity and beginning my strategic privacy. As I left, I sent a short message to Victoria ending the engagement. Her reply was the coup de grace, a dry, silent "okay" that sounded louder than a 1,000-ton explosion. In that vacuum of contempt, I decided to become a ghost. The Arthur who needed love and loyalty died that night, and in his place, I began to forge the sovereign who chooses the cold path of the mountain. 2 years had passed since I became a ghost to the world I once knew. At 40, I no longer inhabited the same emotional reality as others. I lived in independence of control, where, as Machiavelli taught, a wise man depends only on what is under his own management. I was at the mall out of pure necessity, moving with absolute disinterest through the storefronts. I wore loose, simple clothes, a deliberate disguise that hid the rebellion against comfort I practiced daily. Under that heavy fabric, my body was the result of discipline as violence, an act of aggression against my former weakness. I was a stranger in that temple of futility, a wolf who had learned to hide his fangs under a sheep's skin. The encounter was sudden and charged with a biting irony. Julian and Victoria appeared, exuding the arrogance of those who believe they are the center of the universe. The shock on their faces upon seeing me quickly transformed into a theater of false virtue. Victoria, with a voice choked by rehearsed victimization, made sure to mention she was now with Julian. She claimed that since I had abandoned her without explanation, she had spent weeks in shambles, and Julian was the only friend who comforted her in that grief. I listened with glacial coldness, like one analyzing a specimen in a lab. It was the height of hypocrisy. They painted me as the villain to justify their own betrayal, while I remained in a silence that disturbed them. The most revealing detail was what remained unsaid. After my disappearance, neither of them had ever looked for me. Julian's comfort began the exact moment I closed the door, proving the betrayal was consummated long before my anxiety attack. By remaining silent for 2 years, I had created the power of the vacuum, and seeing that they never moved a finger to find me only validated my strategic privacy. I did not seek sympathy, nor did I try to correct their version. I knew that showing pain is giving the enemy the map to be wounded again. I was hiding my wounds absolutely, letting their mediocre narrative fill the space my sovereign silence left empty. Victoria fired the final venom, looking at my humble clothes with contempt. "Arthur, you understand, right? Julian has everything a woman wants. But I know you'll find someone at your level." They walked away laughing, and Julian delivered the verdict. Poor guy. Any day now, someone's going to find him hanging from a rope. They celebrated what they thought was my ruin, not realizing that beneath the loose clothes, my body already reflected the standard of the absolute. I did not negotiate with humiliation. I used emotional alchemy to transform it into strategic capital. The rope they predicted for me would actually be the gallows for their company. I left in silence, the wolf choosing the mountain while the flock laughed in the slaughterhouse. 5 years had passed since Julian and Victoria laughed at my appearance in the mall, totaling 7 years of a silence they mistook for defeat. At 45, I watched from afar as the carcass of Sterling and Co. rotted. The project I had designed, which Julian sucked dry to the last drop, finally became obsolete. Without my brain to innovate, the company was a rudderless ship in a sea of plummeting stocks. Julian, In his chronic incompetence, tried to maintain appearances, but the market does not forgive mediocrity. He was desperate for a miracle, an anonymous buyer to inject capital and save him from the financial abyss he dug for himself with his arrogance and absolute lack of strategic vision. While he crumbled, I consolidated my standard of the absolute. In a world sedated by luxuries, my discipline had been my greatest act of rebellion. I built a conglomerate operating under the radar, applying scarcity and value. I made my time and attention expensive, while Julian became increasingly accessible and desperate. I was no longer the man seeking approval. I was the man dictating the rules. My company, now a silent titan, initiated the acquisition of Sterling. I was about to execute the final phase of my internal war, using my success for the exposing of mediocrity of those who dared believe I was disposable. My identity was a secret Julian was anxious to uncover. The day of the final meeting arrived. Julian entered the room with a forced smile, cold sweat betraying his panic under the expensive suit. He believed the mystery buyer would be his salvation, the useful idiot who would buy his debts and maintain his illusion of power. Victoria was by his side, her face marked by the bitterness of sustaining a facade that was about to collapse. They spoke of synergy and vision for the future, trying to sell a corporate corpse as if it were a golden opportunity. I applied glacial coldness, allowing him to sink into his own lies for a few minutes through my lawyers. Julian didn't realize I wasn't there to save him, but to exercise my framing of reality. When I finally entered the room and sat at the head of the table, the air seemed to escape Julian's lungs. He turned white as a ghost, his eyes wide with pure terror. "Arthur, what are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice failing before my overwhelming presence that exuded authority. Victoria stood frozen, the pride she exhibited at the mall evaporating instantly as she noticed I was not the man of the rope. The death of the old self was complete, and what they saw now was the sovereign they themselves forged through betrayal. I did not seek sympathy. I merely inhabited the freedom of the wolf, watching the flock realize, too late, that the shepherd they betrayed was now the owner of the slaughterhouse. The marble hall of Sterling & Co. was decorated for the acquisition celebration dinner. The luxury was suffocating, but the air vibrated with an invisible tension under the clink of silver cutlery. Julian, sitting at the opposite end, maintained a smile of victory, ignoring the sweat staining his expensive suit. Victoria clutched her pearl necklace, seeking in me the look of the predictable man she thought she could still manipulate. I signed the final contract, and the snap of the gold pen closing sounded like the trigger of an execution. I looked at Julian, the man who believed he had been saved by a financial miracle, and delivered the first sentence with glacial coldness. "My first measure as owner. You are fired. Now, get out of my company." Julian turned pale, the champagne nearly slipping from his trembling hand. "Are you crazy? I built this empire," he stammered, looking for support from the shareholders who now looked at me with fear. I stepped forward, occupying the space he thought still belonged to him, and fired the blow of mercy. "You built nothing, Julian. You inhabited the corpse of a project you stole from me 7 years ago, while I called you brother and you slept with my fiancée. You are a parasite who wore the crown of a genius and believed your own farce." The silence that followed at the table was leaden. Julian's pride evaporated, revealing the incompetent amateur he always was without my brain to guide him. Victoria stood up, rehearsed tears shining under the crystal lights. She tried the last trick of her mediocrity, the trembling voice of one playing the victim. "Arthur, this is cruel." I would never have the heart to betray you. I was in shambles when you disappeared. Julian only comforted me in my grief. She tried to rewrite history, painting the betrayal as an inevitable fate to save her social standing. I observed her with absolute contempt, the gaze of one who no longer inhabits the same emotional plane as her. Never have the heart, Victoria? I asked in a lethal whisper that made the room hold its breath. Then tell me, what exactly is it that everyone is going to see now? I pressed the remote, and the giant screen, which should have shown the new logo, was flooded with grainy images of that fateful afternoon in my old bedroom. The laughter of Julian and the mockery of Victoria saying I was predictable and weak, while they had sex in my own bed, echoed through the luxurious hall like acidic poison. The shock was absolute. Their mask of virtue was shattered before the elite they had tried so hard to impress. I stood up, offering my arm to the stunning woman by my side, and delivered the final checkmate. Julian, you are an amateur. Victoria, you are a mercenary who bet on the loser. I left the hall without looking back. Anxiety dies where discipline governs. The future was mine. Once someone asked me what I did to be so successful at 65, and now you have the final answer. I had the brutal discipline of murdering the man who sought approval to make way for the sovereign who demands results. Success is not a stroke of luck, but the byproduct of an internal war where pity dies, so that execution can take the throne for good. If this reality check has opened your eyes to the parasites draining your energy, your place is in this brotherhood of unshakable minds. Subscribe now to secure your spot in the laboratory of greatness and leave your like as a seal of commitment to your own evolution. The algorithm only favors those who demonstrate the discipline to master their destiny. The difference between the man who cried under the rain and the empire I command today is the discipline of maintaining absolute silence while the mediocre scream for constant validation. Machiavelli taught us that it is much safer to be feared than loved, and I chose the coldness of the mountain instead of the fake warmth of traitors and parasites. Now, prove your readiness by commenting the word discipline to identify yourself among the wolves who do not accept emotional crumbs. Share this strategic vision with that one ally who still possesses real potential, for knowledge is the only gallows capable of liquidating the hidden enemies in your path. The banquet of parasites is over, and your sovereignty has begun. Execute with precision and strength now,